The train station smelled of old rain and metal, the air thick with the kind of stillness that follows too many goodbyes. Margaret Bennett stood near the end of Platform 9, her gloved hands wrapped tightly around a letter she had read a dozen times. The ink was beginning to smudge, not from the rain, but from the tears she never let fall in public. She was not a woman made for goodbyes. Margaret had always been more of a waiting kind, the kind of soul who kept the porch light on, even when no one was expected. James Whittaker was the reason she waited now. Tall, broad-shouldered, always a bit too daring for his own good. He had written her a letter from the front lines 3 weeks ago. In it, he promised her Paris. Not in words of romance, but in the language of possibility. He had written, "When this is over, Maggie, let us go to Paris. I want to see you, laugh under the Eiffel Tower." She folded that letter again now, tucking it into the pocket of her coat as the last whistle blew and the platform began to clear. Her sister, Eliza, stood beside her, arm looped gently through hers. Eliza looked over with quiet concern in her eyes and said softly, "You do not have to keep doing this." Margaret glanced at her, a hint of weariness in her voice as she asked, "Doing what?" Eliza squeezed her arm gently and said, "Coming here, every week, waiting for a train that never carries his name." Margaret did not reply. She simply looked down the track again, as though the answer might arrive with the next gust of wind. The war had changed everything. It had taken boys and returned them as men who barely remembered laughter. But James was different. He wrote her poetry. He made her believe there were still things worth waiting for. And she did. Every Sunday. For nearly a year. Back in her small cottage just outside the edge of Yorkshire, Margaret's life played out in muted tones. Her world existed between stacks of unmailed letters and a fading photograph of James in uniform. She worked part-time in the village library, read war updates with trembling fingers, and prayed every night that no one in uniform would knock at her door. But the silence became its own answer. One night in late March, as the snow began to melt from the edge of her roof, Margaret received a letter, but it was not from James. The envelope bore no return address, only her name, in a script that shook slightly. Inside was a brief note, unsigned. It read, "Do not wait for me. I am not coming back. Forgive me." She read it once, then again. The third time the words blurred into the lines of the firelight. No name, no explanation, just an end written in trembling ink. She did not sleep that night, nor the next. She walked into the library the following morning with the letter still clenched in her hand. Her eyes were swollen from lack of sleep, her steps heavy. Mrs. Holland, her co-worker, a woman too old to remember how it felt to be young and hopeful, looked up from behind the counter and offered her tea with a concerned frown. With a quiet sigh, she said, "You look as though the world has ended." Margaret gave a broken, almost inaudible reply. Her lips barely moved as she whispered, "It has." She told no one else. Not Eliza. Not the postmaster. Not even the boy at the grocer's who used to ask if she was planning a wedding, because deep inside, something felt unfinished. If James were truly gone, he would not have written those words. Not him. Not without a reason. Not without saying goodbye. And so, as spring stretched its way through the moors and tulips bloomed, along the fence posts, Margaret made a choice. She would go to Paris, not for the romance, not for the closure, but because he had written the word, because maybe, just maybe, the story was not over yet. Paris did not greet her with music. There were no violins beneath balconies, no artists painting in the square, no lovers whispering secrets on park benches. It was spring, yes, but the kind that carried a chill, not in the air, but in the eyes of the people who passed her without looking. Margaret stood in the middle of Rue Saint-Honoré, suitcase in one hand, silence in the other. The hotel James once mentioned in his letters, a small inn behind the bookstore with the red door, was still there. It had not changed, except now its windows were shuttered. Dust clung to the corners of the glass as if the place had held its breath too long. She stepped inside, greeted only by a frail concierge with skin like yellowed paper and a stare that did not ask questions. The old man gave her a curious glance and asked gently if she was here alone. Margaret nodded faintly and replied with a soft, distant voice, saying that she believed she always was. The room they gave her faced a narrow alley lined with ivy. It was not much: a bed, a desk, a window that creaked when opened. But it held something the train station did not: stillness. She placed James's photo on the nightstand, folded the letter again, just once this time, then sat by the window and watched the wind braid through the vines. For days she wandered, through cobbled streets and quiet markets, past statues who never blinked and rivers that carried no memory. She ate little, slept less, wrote letters she never mailed, some to James, some to herself. None made it past the drawer. On the 5th day, she walked into the bookstore behind the inn, the one with the red door. The bell above it sang low, as though it remembered her name. Inside, a young man with ink-stained hands arranged a stack of poetry collections near the window. He looked up, surprised to see someone who was not local. With a cautious smile, he asked if she was English. She gave a soft nod and replied that she was. He offered a gentle smile and remarked that not many tourists came now, and that she was very brave. Margaret gave a small, tired laugh and said quietly, "Or very lost." The clerk did not press her, but his eyes, gentle and curious, lingered on her a moment longer than politeness required. She browsed without buying, found herself drifting toward the shelf that held French war memoirs, then past it, then returned. Her fingers hesitated over a book that looked familiar. She pulled it down. Inside the front cover was a signature: J. Whitaker. Her knees buckled slightly as she sank onto the nearest bench. She opened the book. It was a novel, not one he had ever mentioned in letters, but the handwriting, bold and leaning slightly to the left, it was his. She turned pages quickly. Near the middle, in the margins, he had written something in pencil. "You would have hated this chapter. Too many endings." A laugh escaped her. Small, tired, but real. She looked up at the clerk, her voice trembling slightly as she told him the book had belonged to someone she had lost. The young man tilted his head thoughtfully, then said he remembered the man. A soldier, quiet and kind, who often bought poetry and wrote in the margins. The clerk explained that the soldier once said he was saving a place. When she asked, softly, "For what?" the clerk replied, "For someone who would read it after him." She placed the book gently in her lap. Paris had always seemed like an illusion, a dream James had planted in her letters. But now, here was something real, something touched, something left behind. The clerk, sensing her silence, went back to his shelves. And Margaret sat there for a long time, the book pressed against her heart like a pulse she had almost forgotten how to follow. She did not cry. Not yet. Not because she did not want to, but because it still felt like the story was breathing. That night, she dreamed of James. Not the uniformed James of photographs, but the boy with messy hair and ink on his fingertips. He stood in a bookstore, smiling, holding open a book she had never read. When she reached for it, he vanished. She woke up gasping. The wind outside rustled the ivy, and for the first time since the letter, she whispered his name out loud. James. The next morning, the bookstore clerk handed her a sealed envelope. No words, just a gesture. Quiet, careful, as if he feared the letter might dissolve if handled too quickly. She stared at it. Her fingers trembled, but her voice held steady as she asked where he had gotten it. The clerk explained that a man had left it with him months ago, said someone would come, and that he would know her when he saw her. The envelope bore only her name. No return address, no military stamp, only the familiar curve of her name, written in the ink that had never truly faded from her memory. She did not open it in the shop. She carried it back to the hotel, sat on the bed with the window open, the sounds of a city that had long stopped noticing her drifting in through the ivy. For a moment, she held the letter close to her chest. Then, she opened it. Maggie, if you are reading this, then you have found something I never believed you would search for. I do not know what the world looks like now. I do not know if your hair is still tied the way I loved, or if you still hum when you fold the laundry. But I know you, and I know that even in silence, your love echoes louder than war. I was not supposed to survive the last mission, and when I did, I ran. Not from duty, from myself, from what I had done, from what I had seen. There are things I carry now that would drown you if I tried to explain them. But I never stopped loving you. Not for 1 second. I left that book in the store with the hope that one day you might come to Paris. And if you did, I needed something of me to meet you there. I do not know if I can come back. But if you are still waiting, I will try. Look for me at the bridge. The one with the locks. James. The letter fell into her lap. Her breath escaped in a sob she had held back for far too long. He had been alive, all this time. Alive, but silent. Present, but hidden. She stood slowly. Her body felt lighter, but her chest carried a weight that might never lift. She remembered the bridge. The one with the locks. Pont des Arts. She had passed it once. A place where lovers left padlocks carved with initials and tossed the keys into the Seine. She had not believed in such things before, but now, the whole world felt like a sign. She grabbed her coat. The walk to the bridge was short, but her thoughts stretched wide. Every step carried memories of him in uniform, of their last goodbye at the train station, of promises whispered into collarbones and letters sealed with longing. And then, she saw him, or thought she did. At the far edge of the bridge stood a man in a coat too large for spring, his shoulders slightly hunched, hands tucked into his pockets. He faced the water. Margaret stopped walking. Her heart thudded painfully. She whispered to herself, not daring to speak louder. James? The man turned. But it was not him. The face was wrong, the eyes unfamiliar. He smiled politely, stepped past her, and disappeared into the crowd. She stood alone on the bridge, breathing, shaking. She searched the locks, 1,000 of them. Old names, new names, initials carved by trembling hands in every language love has ever spoken. But she found nothing. No lock, no James, no ending. Just the wind and the ache of almost. She sat on the edge of the bridge, her legs pulled close to her chest. The Seine moved slowly beneath her, uncaring, eternal. And Margaret. She let the silence hold her. She would wait. Not because she was told to, but because her heart did not know how not to. The lock could come tomorrow, or never. But she had found the letter. She had found the book. She had found hope. Fragile, flickering, real. And that, for now, was enough. The next morning, Paris felt different. It was not the weather, though the skies had softened and the sun broke gently through pale clouds. It was something inside Margaret, a shift, subtle, but unmistakable. She walked slowly, tracing the edge of the Seine like one might trace the spine of an old letter. Carefully, reverently, without rushing. She passed the cafes that had once seemed indifferent. Now they looked softer, less foreign, less cruel. James had been here, not just in memory, in movement, in ink. She carried the letter with her, folded twice and pressed inside her coat pocket like a compass. It did not tell her where to go, but it reminded her that she was not lost. Later that afternoon, she returned to the bookstore. The red door creaked, familiar now. The bell overhead offered a quieter chime, as if it too remembered her name. The clerk greeted her with a nod. No words, just recognition, the kind that sits somewhere between sadness and solidarity. She walked to the corner near the poetry shelf, the place where she had found the novel with his handwriting. She sat there quietly, the book resting on her lap. She was not waiting for James. Not exactly. She was waiting for what came next. That was when she saw a man. Not James. He was tall, older than the clerk, with a worn satchel and the sort of cautious steps that suggested he no longer trusted the ground beneath him. He lingered near the door, looked around, then noticed her. Their eyes met for just a moment. Something in his glance felt familiar. He approached slowly, almost reluctantly, as though the air between them might break if he stepped too hard. With a cautious, almost reverent tone, he asked if she was Margaret. Her breath caught. Her voice was barely audible as she nodded and said she was. He reached into his satchel and pulled out an envelope, aged, torn at the edges, but still sealed. He explained gently that James had asked him to give it to her, if he ever saw her. When she asked if he knew James, the man hesitated. Then he said they had served together. Not friends exactly, but James had spoken of her. Often. He paused, and then, in a low, aching voice, he said that every time James wrote her name, it was like he forgot they were at war. Margaret's hands trembled as she took the envelope. She looked up, her voice tight with hope and dread, and asked where James was. The man shook his head. His voice softened. He told her that the last time he saw James was in a field hospital. He was not dying, but broken in ways that could not be seen on X-rays. James had left in the middle of the night. No one saw him go. But before he left, he gave the man that letter and said, "If you ever meet a woman who looks like she lost something permanent, it will be her." The stranger tipped his head in quiet farewell and left. No name. No more answers. Just another shadow in a long trail of almosts. Margaret opened the letter on the bench. "I wanted to meet you again in silence, in a place that had room for what we could no longer say out loud. I left Paris not because I stopped loving you, but because I loved you too much to let you see me that way. There is a place just outside the city, a farmhouse, red shutters, a garden with forget-me-nots and an old wooden gate. If you come, I will wait." There was no address, no map, just a memory and a direction. The bookstore clerk watched her fold the paper with hands that shook less than before. With gentle concern, he asked if she was going to find him. Margaret gave a small, sure nod and replied softly, "I have already found him. Now, I just need to meet him again." And so she did what few women of her time dared to do. She hired a car, packed her small case, carried no map, only trust, and she left Paris. Not for escape, not for romance, not even for closure. She left because there was a letter, and she had never let one go unanswered. The countryside outside Paris looked like a painting that had faded at the edges. Stone cottages leaned gently into the earth, as if they had been tired for a long time. Trees lined the narrow road like quiet witnesses. Wildflowers tangled along, fences, and the wind. It carried something that felt like memory. Margaret sat in the back of the car, the letter clutched softly in her lap. The driver, a man of few words and kind eyes, did not ask where she was going. She had only shown him the note. She said gently, "A farmhouse, red shutters, a garden of forget-me-nots." He had nodded once and started the engine. It took nearly 2 hours. Then, they stopped. The farmhouse stood near the edge of a hillside, just where the trees gave way to sky. Its shutters were faded, red, chipped with time, but still holding on. A crooked wooden gate hung slightly ajar, and beyond it, a garden. Not neat, not pruned, but alive. Flowers bloomed in every corner. Forget-me-nots, wild lavender, even a few stubborn roses. A wooden chair rested beneath an old elm tree, its back broken slightly. A watering can lay on its side, rust blooming along the handle. Margaret stepped out of the car. The wind tugged at her coat. The silence. It felt familiar. She pushed the gate gently. It creaked softly, not loud, not sharp, just enough to announce a presence. She called out softly, her voice shaking. "James?" No answer. She took slow steps toward the house, past the flowers that seemed to lean in as she passed. The door was half open. Inside, it smelled of old books and firewood. The walls were bare, except for a single painting above the hearth. A watercolor of the Seine. Her fingers brushed the corner of the frame. Dust clung to her glove. She turned toward the back door. It was open to the garden, and there, under the elm, someone sat. Not upright, not waiting, collapsed. She ran. His coat was too big, his boots untied, his face thinner than memory. Loud and pale, far too pale. But the eyes, even closed, she would have known them. She fell to her knees beside him and pressed her hand to his face, still warm. She shook him gently. He stirred. A low sound escaped him. Pain, or surprise, or maybe both. His eyes opened slowly, and there she was. Tears slipped down her cheeks before she even realized they had formed. He whispered hoarsely, his lips cracking from the wind. "I dreamed this. You. Here." Margaret leaned closer, her voice catching as she whispered, "You are not dreaming." He tried to sit. She stopped him with a gentle touch. "You wrote to me," she said softly. "You told me to come." He looked up at her, disbelief and guilt in his gaze. "I did not know if you would." She smiled through her tears and said, "I would have come even without a letter." His eyes flickered with something between shame and wonder. "I am not the man I was." She nodded slowly. "Neither am I." The wind shifted around them. He looked at her as if afraid she might vanish if he blinked. "I could not come home," he murmured. "Not after what I saw, what I did." Her voice was calm, steady, but thick with emotion as she replied, "Then let us stay here, not as who we were, but who we are now." There was a pause, and then he wept. Not the quiet, restrained sorrow of a soldier trained to survive, but the broken, body-shaking sob of someone who had finally run out of places to hide. She held him. There, in that overgrown garden, among flowers he had once promised to grow, among ghosts he had stopped trying to outrun. No words were needed. Grief and love. They shared the same silence. As the sun dipped lower, casting gold, across the field, she leaned closer and whispered against his shoulder, "I never stopped waiting." James did not speak much after that day. He spent his mornings in the garden, hands buried in soil that had not felt life in months. His back ached, his knees gave him trouble. But he worked, slowly, deliberately, as if planting flowers could somehow undo everything he had buried. Margaret stayed in the farmhouse. She read aloud in the evenings. Poetry, mostly. Sometimes, the letters he had once sent her. Once, even the note that had nearly broken her heart. He never asked her to stop. He never asked her to read something else. Because those words, once full of distance and paper-thin hope, sounded different when she read them aloud. They sounded like forgiveness. Some days he would talk. Never about the war. Never about the night he vanished. Only about the things that did not hurt to remember. He told her how he once dreamed of opening a bakery in Brighton. How he used to draw faces in the fog on train windows. How he had memorized her handwriting the way soldiers memorize escape routes. They sat often in silence. Not because they had nothing to say, but because they had already said the worst. The weeks passed without ceremony. Paris faded into memory. The world outside the farmhouse continued spinning, faster, louder, more carelessly than either of them remembered. But in their little patch of quiet, time slowed. One morning, Margaret woke to find a box on the kitchen table. Inside, there was a lock, gold, simple, unmarked, and a note. It read, "For the bridge, when you are ready." Her hand trembled as she picked it up. Not because she doubted what it meant, but because it meant everything. That afternoon, they returned to Paris. The city had softened, or perhaps she had. It was not the Paris James had promised, nor was it the one she had feared, but it was theirs now. touched by sorrow, painted with survival. They walked together to Pont des Arts. The locks had changed, some old, some new, but the promise they held, it lingered. James handed her the key. She took it with both hands, slipped the lock through the metal railing, and snapped it shut. They stood together and watched the key fall, twisting in sunlight, before vanishing beneath the surface of the Seine. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. Closure does not always come in words. Sometimes, it comes in staying. That night, in the small inn behind the bookstore, Margaret stood by the window, the same one where she had once dreamed of him returning. And now, he had changed, bruised, real. James walked up behind her, his arms slipping gently around her waist. He rested his chin lightly on her shoulder and asked, with quiet wonder, if she thought the river remembered. Margaret smiled softly and replied, "No, but I do." He pressed a kiss to her shoulder. Nothing grand, nothing poetic. Just quiet. Just home. And there, under the slow breath of a city that had carried them both through every kind of silence, Margaret whispered something she had never said aloud before. She said, "Thank you for not dying." James's eyes closed, and he whispered back, "Thank you for not leaving." And so, two people who had once been lost, in war, in memory, in regret, found a place that did not need to be perfect. Just enough. The letters were never thrown away. The photograph remained framed. But now, beside it, sat a lock, untouched by rust, unopened, unforgotten. Because love, when written in the ink of survival, never truly fades. Sometimes the people we love disappear before they can explain why. And sometimes, we wait, even when the world tells us not to. If this story held your heart even for a moment, stay with us. Because some stories are not just told, they are remembered. Comment your thoughts. Subscribe.